It was last Sunday, roughly around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his bevy of lawyers and supporters entered the High Court building on Salah Din Street in Arab East Jerusalem. The first thing that the Prime Minister did once inside the building is to give a press conference in which he maligned the justice system, the High Court judges, the journalists, and everybody in Israel who did not agree with him or support him. Then he and his supporters and lawyers went up to the third floor and entered hall number 317, where he came face to face with the charges against him. 3 charges, 3 cases, cases 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. And with this simple fact, the press conference and the first court hearing, not only did the trial of the king of Israel, the magician of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, start somewhat in earnest, although it will be weeks and months long before we know where it's heading, but it also established, in my opinion, the connection, the causal nexus between this court case and the annexation by the Prime Minister Netanyahu of Palestinian lands. Why? Because in order to avoid following the 12th Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and ending up in jail, if the verdict of the High Court is guilty, Benjamin Netanyahu, the 13th Prime Minister of Israel, is trying to galvanize, to mobilize public support for him in order to challenge the legal system and the rule of law. How this whole process will pan out is anybody's guess at this stage, and the weeks and months ahead will tell us what could happen or not. So welcome to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. This is number 3. I'm not going to talk about the EU. I'm not going to talk about the US administration. I'm not even going to talk about the Arab states and the Arab League. What I would like to do in those few minutes is basically to say what is at stake and how does it impact 2 peoples and 2 governments, those of Jordan and those of Palestine. Let me start by mentioning what is at stake. What is at stake is not only a sheer annexation of some more chunks of Palestinian land. I've heard reports that another 30% of Palestinian lands will be seized and annexed by Israel. That might give some people a clue of what is happening. It might not do for others, because the outcome of this annexation of the cluster of settlements around Jerusalem, which is known by many people in the business, as it were, as E1, as well as the western landmass of Israel and the Jordan Valley that borders between Jordan and a future sovereign Palestinian state, if those are annexed, whether in separate, slow-moving chapters or all together, will pretty much mean that Palestine is gone, Palestine has become surrounded in a cage, and all Palestinians will be living in Bantustans, irrespective of what name you give to these Bantustans put together. So that is what's at stake. What's at stake is, once and for all, the future of the 2-state solution and the future of the aspirations and dreams of most Palestinians for their own state. Now let's start by Jordan. How does this impact Jordan? It impacts Jordan because it impacts Jordan's national security. There is a border between Israel and Jordan. And there is also, at the same time, a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, which was concluded in October 1994 in the Wadi Araba crossing in southern Jordan. And people say that that treaty is a guarantor that Jordan will not speak out against this annexation. I disagree. I would argue, I would suggest that Jordan would incrementally up the ante if Benjamin Netanyahu were to undertake this wholesale annexation, and if his number 2 prime minister, Benny Gantz, weren't to stop him or try to cool down his annexationist ardor. Remember, Jordan as a Hashemite dynasty is not the kind of governance that comes out with bombastic statements. They give out subtle hints. And those subtle hints included, in my opinion, call them warnings if you wish, included an interview by King Abdullah II of Jordan to the Der Spiegel German online paper, in which he basically warned Israel of the colossal consequences of this annexation. He further repeated this same warning, as did his prime minister. Go back a bit and remember that in the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel, Jordan leased to Israel 2 tracts of rich agricultural land in the kingdom, one in the north and one in the south. One is Baqura and the other is Al-Ghamr. When the lease expired, everybody thought that Jordan would surreptitiously or otherwise renew the lease and keep it with Israel. They didn't. They took back both tracts of land and hoisted the Jordanian flag on it. Go further, Ahlam al-Tamimi, who has been charged with murder for the attack on the Sbarro pizzeria in Israel. The Americans want her extradited from Jordan. The Jordanian government to date has resisted and has said no. Jordan is not a puppet kingdom as some people might think. Jordan has shown more courage than a lot of those other bigger, more resource-friendly, and more powerful Arab countries amongst the 22 Arab states in the region. Remember 1990? Whilst many Arab countries rushed into a coalition with the Americans against Iraq, Jordan refused, the king refused, and it led to economic sanctions and political ostracism for a while. But eventually, Jordan, which plays a strategic role in so many different directions, was readmitted into the fold, as it were, and now would count America and the United Kingdom, as well as the European Union, as some of its best friends. What I'm trying to say is that don't count on Jordan staying silent or turning the other way or not really reacting if this annexation were to take hold. I think it impacts their national security. It also impacts their people. Remember, a lot of those are Palestinian themselves, and therefore I would expect the Jordanians to speak out and to act, but perhaps to act incrementally. If we now look at Palestine, the only thing I would say, at the risk of repeating a cliche, is that the Palestinians should get their act together. Hamas should renounce its own unilateralist political tendencies, using one Arab country against another for its own ends, and work with the Palestinian Authority which is full of political warts itself, admittedly, and try and have one united Palestinian standpoint. This is no longer a game of who runs what, who elects whom, how many deputies in the moribund legislative assembly there will be from this faction or that faction. This is truly a serious moment for Palestinians. And just imagine if there is an annexation, how that could impact Jordan and the Palestinians if suddenly thousands upon thousands of Palestinians were to leave the West Bank and head to Jordan. A Jordan that does not have the resources, that does not have the ability to take on more refugees. It's got the Palestinians from 1948 and 1967. It's got the Iraqis, it's got the Syrians. So not only will it impact the infrastructure and institutions of Jordan, but it will also mean that the Palestinians are forfeiting their long-held views on statehood, on refugeehood, on Jerusalem. So both sides are facing a critical moment. And that critical moment might well come if in summer Netanyahu decides to annex parts of the West Bank Palestinian occupied lands. He might not go for the Jordan Valley immediately, but he might go for the cluster of settlements. He might look toward Hebron or Al Khalil. He might look elsewhere in order to show his supporters. And here is where I make the causal connection. His supporters, not only those who want him to remain prime minister for those 18 months and more, but those who are supporting him and saying Netanyahu is not guilty, Netanyahu is innocent, the High Court is besmirching the reputation of a wonderful man. So the weeks and months ahead are going to be quite critical. And I think that it behoves us all well to realize what is at stake. This concludes pretty much my trilogy on annexation for the moment. And knowing full well that out there in the real world, not here in my little world in front of the computer, the COVID-19 is still wreaking havoc with us in the UK, with Europe, with the Middle East, what's happening in the Middle East, in places like Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen and Syria, and further afield into the Gulf, into Saudi Arabia and Qatar and elsewhere. That is also part of the real world. So please, all of you who listen to this YouTube episode, stay safe and keep well.